Hello, learners. Welcome to another lecture in this NPTEL course on Victorian literature. In the previous lectures, we have begun thinking about the work of a very important Victorian poet named Toru Dutt. I have described, by reference to Edmund Gossie's introductory memoir to the 1882 volume Legends and Ballads of Hindustan, how Toru Dutt's entry into the Victorian canon was a matter of chance, and the story of how Toru Dutt became recognized as a Victorian writer worth some serious consideration is itself an important historical account. That account refers to Toru Dutt's education mostly in India but partly in Europe, her attempts to settle in England, her father's education, the long tradition of English education in the Dutt family, and finally the short lives of both Toru Dutt and her siblings, lives that were tragically shortened by tuberculosis, a life whose shortness was directly proportional to the kind of literary respect and merit that Toru Dutt posthumously garnered. This story also sheds light on the theory of Orientalism, and within that theory, the historical introduction of English education in India. Very briefly, I have referred to the lecture of Thomas Babington Macaulay, in which Macaulay justified the introduction of Indian education in English by arguing that such a decision would ensure that several generations of English-speaking Indians would be created. This generation would be a biracial, bichromatic, and bicultural breed of Indians who would be Indian in their physical or bodily composition, but Western in their intellectual and cultural composition. Such a class of Indians would be highly beneficial to the British Empire, as they would supply the ever-increasing need for clerks and officers in the British government. This was the plan according to Thomas Macaulay. And to a great extent, the history of modern India following the introduction of English education follows this script. And this has also been demonstrated by several post-colonial scholars and critics. However, there is another side to this story, as I have mentioned a few times. The other side of the story can be seen in the work of Toru Dutt. Now, going by Macaulay's script and vision for the future of the Indian subcontinent, the introduction of English education in India would supply an increasing army of clerks and officers, Indians who knew how to use English, the language of rule and command, for the sake of making the task of governance easier. We see in the work of Toru Dutt, however, that an Indian uses the English language not to aid the governance of the British Empire, but to find a place in the literary history of England. In fact, this is the exact claim that Edmund Gossie makes in his introductory memoir to the Legends and Ballads of Hindustan. The claim that Gossie makes is that Toru Dutt's work deserves a place in the literary history of Victorian England. This was something that Thomas Macaulay could not have imagined. As we read in the previous lecture, Macaulay's valuation of Indian literature and European or English literature were radically different. Indian literature was supposed to be fantastical, supernatural, not very civilized, and lacking in scientific or rational merits. On the other hand, European literature was the perfect medicine or a tool for civilization. This claim is challenged and subverted in the work of an Indian writer who refers to Indian mythology, the same body of knowledge which was considered supernatural, irrational, uncivilized, etc., by Macaulay and several other Orientalists, and combines this body of knowledge with English language and literature, And the result of this combination is a work that is admitted into this very hallowed chamber, the very exclusive club of English literature, by highly reputed and influential Victorian literary critic. So, in a nutshell, I have summarized the kind of progress we have been tracking, the story of how Toru Dutt's work becomes an important piece of Victorian literature, even though it is an instance of the use of English by an Indian writer. Let us now try and understand exactly how Toru Dutt's work find a place in the English canon. And I also introduced this idea by referring to the history of the sonnet in the English language. I referred to different versions of the sonnet, the Petrarchan, the Italian, the Shakespearean, as well as the English sonnet. Now, the key difference between the Italian and the English, or the Petrarchan and the Shakespearean, is that in the Petrarchan sonnet, the lines are divided into two parts, an octave and a sestet, and both these sections have couplets. The rhyme scheme usually follows an ABBA, ABBA for the octave, and a CD-CD-EE or a CDE-CDE for the sestet. And the departure from the Petrarchan is found most prominently in the Shakespearean sonnet, in which instead of an octave and a sestet, we get three quatrains and a couplet. That is, the rhyme scheme is divided into 6 sounds, which is found in 3 quatrains and a couplet. In some versions of the Petrarchan, the last 2 lines also constitute a couplet, but that is only accidental and that is not by design. Additionally, in the Petrarchan sonnet, we get a change of tone or a change of idea roughly in the middle of the sonnet, that is in the 8th or the 9th line, that is the last line of the octave. One sequence of ideas, one logical or emotional progression of ideas is interrupted. It is challenged, it faces a kind of stumbling block or a roadblock and reverses its direction. This reversal is called a volta or a volte-face, and in the Petrarchan or Italian sonnet, it is found roughly in the middle, around the 8th line. As against the English version, in the Shakespearean version, this is found towards the end of the 3rd quatrain, that is, roughly line 12. And the last 2 lines, 13 and 14, following this volta in the English sonnet, perform a kind of saving grace. They recoup what has been lost or shattered due to this interruption. So this is a brief summary of the difference in the progression of sound and the development of sense between the Petrarchan and the Shakespearean sonnets. Further, we described how Toru Dutt's sonnet Baugmaree combines both of these two forms. It takes features of both the Petrarchan and the Shakespearean. It takes features of the Shakespearean because it ends with a couplet, but it takes the rhyme scheme more generally of the Petrarchan because it divides itself into an octave and a sestet. That is, the first 8 lines repeat 2 sounds at the end of every line, which means it forms a typical ABBA, ABBA Petrarchan octave. Further, we also find a change of tone or a change of scene or an interruption in the 8th line in Toru Dutt's Baugmaree. Further, we also recall how in the Victorian era there was a great deal of discussion about which is the most accurate or legitimate version of the sonnet, that is, whether it was more acceptable to practice the Petrarchan or the Shakespearean version of the sonnet. And by writing this sonnet in the Petrarchan form, Toru Dutt signals that she is in tune with and sensitive to the literary debates of her time. And she's also desirous, as a writer of this sonnet, of being accepted as a serious and conventional writer of sonnets. That is, the choice of the Petrarchan form signals Toru Dutt's desire to be accepted as a writer of sonnets in the Victorian literary culture of her time. Now, we have covered this much ground in previous lecture. This was a brief summary. Let us now read Baugmaree again and try and understand exactly what Toru Dutt's achievement in this poem constitutes of, and how this sonnet cements Toru Dutt's place in the literary history of Victorian English literature. This is the sonnet again. A sea of foliage girds our garden round, but not a sea of dull, unvaried green. Sharp contrasts of all colors here are seen. The light green, graceful tamarinds abound. Amid the mango clumps of green profound, and palms arise like pillars grey between, and over the quiet pools the sea mills lean, red, red, and startling like a trumpet's sound. But nothing can be lovelier than the ranges of bamboos to the eastward, when the moon looks through their gaps, and the white lotus changes into a cup of silver. One might swoon drunken with beauty then, or gaze and gaze on a primeval Eden in amaze. As I mentioned, there is an interruption in the 8th line. This is the line that reads, red, red, and startling like a trumpet's sound. There is a trumpet sound which interrupts the speaker or the poet's description of the colors in this very eye-catching garden. In addition to the eye, which is the one sense that has been activated so far, the ears are activated in this line. And there is a sound that startles the poet. The sound is compared to the sight of a color red. The red of the sea mills is as startling as the sound of a trumpet in the poet's ear. One way to read the sentence is to say that the interruption is not an actual interruption, but rather the interruption is more imagined by the poet, and the word startle as well as the word trumpet are simply devices that are designed to exaggerate and describe how striking the color red is. Another way to read this line is to say that while the poet is observing these colors, there is something, even if not an actual trumpet sound, there is something that challenges, interrupts, stops the poet from continuing as she was before, and demands that the poet undertake a change of gear or a change of perspective. We can see that this change is demanded by the circumstances from the lines that follow. In fact, the very next line begins with the word but. But nothing can be lovelier than the ranges of bamboos to the eastward, when the moon looks through their gaps and the white lotus changes into a cup of silver. So the poet's gaze turns at this moment. Until now, before this line, red, red, and startling like a trumpet sound, the poet has been observing one side of the garden. The poet has been observing trees inside the garden. After this line, the poet turns and looks outside the garden to bamboo ranges. That is, something outside, hills or mountains that have bamboo trees on them. And it is this gaze looking outward that completes the poet's view and complements what the poet has already seen inside the garden. This combination of both the outside and the inside, this is something that the poet combines into a holistic and much more compounded view of her garden. Now, this interruption of the trumpet sound, in order to contextualize this sound, right, we can read some other poems and we can see how Toru Dutt was inspired by other English poets of her time and poets who were greatly respected in the time that Toru Dutt was writing this book. In order to understand this context, the context in which Toru Dutt wrote Baugmaree, we need to examine some biographical details. And examining these biographical details will reveal how this poem, Baugmaree, is a document of the international culture of Victorian England and how literature connects both nations as well as individuals and cultures quite diverse from Victorian England. Let us now read a little bit of biographical detail. In the year 1874, Toru Dutt wrote to her very close friend Mary Martin. Dutt wrote, "I do so want to see your dear old face again. Oh, to be in England now that April's there, sing I with Robert Browning." So, in this letter, Dutt quotes Robert Browning to describe a longing to be in England, right? Which poem is this, and what exactly does this quote achieve in Dutt's communication? The poem from which Dutt quotes is titled Homeward Thoughts from Abroad in the year 1845. What does this poem do? Let us read some lines from this poem and try and understand exactly what is the sentiment that Dutt wants to borrow from this poem by Robert Browning, and what exactly is the reference to Browning doing? What emotional work does the Browning quote do in Toru Dutt's letter to Mary Martin? Browning writes, "Homeward thoughts from abroad. Oh, to be in England now that April's there, and whoever wakes in England sees some morning unaware that the lowest boughs and the brushwood sheaf round the elm tree bole are in tiny leaf, while the chaffinch sings on the orchard bough in England now. And after April, when May follows, and the white-throat builds and all the swallows, hark where my blossomed pear tree in the hedge leans to the field and scatters on the clover blossoms and dewdrops at the bent spray's edge. That's the wise thrush, he sings each song twice over, lest you should think he never could recapture the first fine careless rapture." So in this poem, which is also a sonnet, and the rhyme scheme, if one listens to the end of every word, also follows the Petrarchan, but with slight modifications. So this is a sign as to what Toru Dutt was trying to achieve, even with her experimentation with poetic form. The reference to Browning signals a particular connection to England's national literary culture. Toru Dutt replicates the experimentation with the sonnet form that Browning undertakes in Homeward Thoughts. But in addition to simply the formal and technical aspects of the sonnet form, there is something more that we get in the last four lines of the Browning poem, which is an ironic connection to national ideology of 19th century Victorian England. The last lines of Browning's poem read, "And though the fields look rough with hoary dew, all will be gay when noontide wakes anew. The buttercups, the little children's dower, far brighter than this gaudy melon flower." So what we see in these four lines is some unease, some discomfort with a simplistic celebration of England's national landscape or literary culture. This is an ironic national poem because Browning celebrates and satirizes the romanticized English pastoral as a synecdoche for the best of England, and Dutt aptly combines her desire for a return to England with a voice that represents English nationhood in a peculiar manner. Why is it peculiar? The gaudy melon flower in Browning references another poem about England, actually another poetic theorization about the place, the value of nationalism and national culture in poetic discourse. That is the advertisement to the 1798 document Lyrical Ballads by William Wordsworth. In that document, William Wordsworth had used the word gaudy. He used the word gaudy to describe, and I quote, "gaudy and inane phraseology of many modern writers." The 1798 document Lyrical Ballads is widely considered as the document that made poetry modern. That is, it took poetry from the 18th to the 19th century. Chronologically, it did that because it was published in the last decade of the 18th century. But in terms of the quality and the emotional and intellectual terrain that poetry was supposed to cover, William Wordsworth made poetry a modern document. In Wordsworth's view, poetry became a communication between human beings. It was less of a performance and more of a conversation that one person had with others. Indeed, Wordsworth writes that poetry is a man talking to men. This was different because earlier poetry was seen as a highly technical linguistic performance. There were elaborate rhyme schemes, there were elaborate stress patterns, there was a lot of technical mastery which was required in order to create a poetic utterance. And it's not that technical mastery disappears or is dispensed with. In fact, far from it, we can see that Wordsworth's own work is technically quite masterful. But what is unmistakable is that mere performance or linguistic accuracy and linguistic sophistication for the sake of linguistic sophistication is rejected as gaudy and inane. So when Browning refers to the gaudy melon flower, and the word again is the gaudy melon flower is referring to nature, that is flowers, but is being observed in Europe, right? So observing flowers is a gaudy thing in Browning's poem. And as against this, Browning refers to the simple and the natural beauties of England. But there's something about the word gaudy which references Wordsworth, right? Now, in Browning, the word gaudy refers to the language of inauthenticity. In Wordsworth, the word gaudy referred to the inauthenticity of most 18th century poetry. In Browning, the word gaudy refers to a way of talking about flowers, natural beauty, trees, etc., which was quite popular in Wordsworth's own time, but which by the time Browning is writing has come to appear inauthentic and a sort of performance for the sake of performance. So we see that English poetry is evolving, and the same word gaudy, which Wordsworth had used to describe the performative poetry of 18th century, is used in the Victorian era by Browning to describe other poems which were inspired by Wordsworth's love of nature. So, gaudy melon flower refers to a way of talking about nature in English poetry, and for Browning, that is a little bit gaudy. So, when Toru Dutt quotes from Browning's poem to describe her desire to return to England, she is also signaling an affirmation and her agreement and her alignment with a particular attitude towards the use of nature in English poetry. Simply referring to nature like melon flowers can be gaudy. Instead, what is more important is the sincerity of the feeling that is conveyed in Robert Browning's poem. What is the feeling? A sort of nostalgic memory, a sort of nostalgic connection to England, which Browning feels when he is abroad in Europe. And it is that combination of nostalgia with a minor sense of irritation at certain ways of expressing nostalgia, that is gaudy melon flower. It is this unique combination of a critique of certain poetic styles and the expression of one's longing for a place, that is England in the case of Browning, also England in the case of Toru Dutt. It is this combination that Toru Dutt references in her letter, and we can see how this combination is reflected in this poem, Baugmaree. Now, Baugmaree is a hybrid form because it combines both Petrarchan and Shakespearean forms, Italian and English, and ultimately it challenges the homogeneity of the sonnet form as it implicitly questions the nationality of the sonnet. Right? How does this happen? Now, in order to understand this relationship better, we need to pay attention to how and why Toru Dutt described this garden at a late point in her life. As I mentioned in my biographical introduction to Toru Dutt's life, this poem was written at a time when the Dutts had returned from England and were facing a sort of depressing, not very happy situation. The situation was that the family's efforts to settle permanently in England had failed, and they were looking at an indefinite future in Calcutta. Now, for the Dutt siblings, of whom Toru was the only one remaining at this time, her sister who passed away a few years earlier, for Toru Dutt, this was a situation that was mixed with both happiness and a sort of sadness. The sadness came from the fact that Dutt was very aware of how an educated and highly anglicized and cultured woman who had a strong affinity for European and English culture and was also trained in the somewhat individual ways of those places, would struggle to make it on her own in India. The values were very different in the Calcutta of her time. And even though Calcutta was several generations ahead of other parts of India in terms of the attitudes towards women and the reforms to Hindu society that were already undertaken in Bengal, there was still a great deal of difference between the kind of freedom that a woman could have, an educated English and French speaking writer like Toru Dutt was, the kind of freedom that a person like that would have in England, and the kind of the limited freedom that she would have in Calcutta. So the garden became a sort of refuge from this world which did not allow a lot of freedoms to women. In fact, there are many letters in which Toru describes being unable to walk around freely in the city as she had been used to in England and in Europe. So the garden became a place of solace, consolation, and really a making peace with the limits of one's situation. It is also worthwhile to refer to another sonnet here by William Wordsworth, which also combines the Petrarchan and the Shakespearean sonnets and describes how a poet can balance the accuracy of linguistic form with the expression of sincere feelings and emotions. The poem is titled Scorn Not the Sonnet by William Shakespeare, and this poem will help us understand the peculiar use of the word trumpet as well. Wordsworth writes, Scorn not the sonnet, critic, you have frowned, mindless of its just honors. With this key, Shakespeare unlocked his heart. The melody of this small lute gave ease to Petrarch's wound. 1,000 times this pipe did Tasso sound. With it, Camoens soothed an exile's grief. The sonnet glittered a gay myrtle leaf, amid the cypress with which Dante crowned his visionary brow, a glowworm lamp. It cheered mild Spencer, called from fairyland to struggle through dark ways. And when a damp fell round the path of Milton, in his hand the thing became a trumpet, whence he blew soul-animating strains, alas, too few. The rhyme scheme of this sonnet is ABBA, ABBA, CD, CD, EE. So very clearly, we see a clear division into three quatrains and a couplet. The octave is solidly divided into two sounds, which means that the first two quatrains are actually part of an octave. And here the allegiance is very clearly to the Petrarchan form and not the Shakespearean. In addition, we see the word trumpet here. Trumpet is used to describe how John Milton used the sonnet to describe how the angels are summoned in his poem Paradise Lost. However, there's also an indication that this was too little too late, or that it was too few. That is, the proper combination or the efficacy and the prowess of hybrid English Petrarchan combination sonnet is actually very rare, and the fact that Milton used it demonstrates both that it is a powerful thing to do, but also that it is very rare and difficult and therefore very rarely attempted. The fact that the word trumpet is used here connects Toru Dutt's poem to several other male and very, very canonical and influential poets in the tradition of English poetry. This helps us understand how this Bengali Indian female poet was able to connect to these traditions in English writing. And these connections, symbolized in the sound that her sonnet Baugmaree produces, also help us understand that this is an extremely a hybrid form, and it combines both the nationality of the sonnet as well as the global and international and the cosmopolitan nature of Victorian literature. A person so far away from Victorian England could study the writings on poetry published by Victorian writers and use that idiom to describe a reality which was extremely different, radically different, practically unheard of by anyone in Victorian England. So we understand how Toru Dutt is an extremely ingenious, resourceful, and ultimately greatly cosmopolitan writer who has earned her place in the history of English literature through the ingeniousness and the wide range of reference of her humble poem about a family garden in Calcutta. Thank you.